Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World. I'm going to continue my discussion of the road to ordination that I took. Last time I talked about my university training and how that led me to anthropology rather than ordination, and how after I'd been doing field work in the desert in New Mexico and also dealing with various groups, including people in the pueblos and in the Hispano villages, I was led back towards ordination. That was last time. So this time I want to look at the actual path when I returned to New York from New Mexico with the idea that I wanted to be ordained. So let's keep going down that path. Now, I had a lot of choices when I returned to New York in terms of which particular denomination I would be ordained within. My wife was Methodist, and when we returned to our hometown in New York, we started attending the Methodist church because it was comfortable for her and as convenient as anything for me, and I thought, well, that's one possibility, is to seek ordination within the Methodist Church. Well, that didn't work out too well for all kinds of reasons, one of them being that I was not brought up in the Methodist Church, had never been a member of a Methodist church, and also that their guidelines were a little bit beyond what I was capable of. And I also thought about the Church of England, which in hindsight was a bit strange, but I happen to know a number of Anglican priests, both in the United States and in England, very old friends, very dear friends, and I wrote to a number of them, and they all wrote back and said, not a chance. Even though I had a master's degree in theology from Oxford, which is a bulwark of Anglican theology, they just said, well, the church is in decline and we're not taking new people anymore, and a number of our friends have been turned down and so forth, so you don't really stand a chance. So what should have been obvious was that I looked into the Presbyterian church. I'd been a Presbyterian absolutely all of my life. I was baptized in a Presbyterian church in Buenos Aires when I was born. When we moved to England, my family attended the Presbyterian church in Eastbourne. And when we moved to South Australia, we went to the Presbyterian church there, where we attended every Sunday, where in fact my father became a very important member of the church, eventually being the clerk of session, but also the superintendent of Sunday school, and he was involved in getting more and more people into the church, because when we first arrived it was kind of dismal. There were about 10 people in the church, and he built it up quite significantly by going around to various people's houses and making phone calls and so forth. And then when we returned to England, I became a member of the choir at the church in Slough, where we lived. and was confirmed within that church, so that pretty much from the age of about 4 to 19, I had been involved in the Presbyterian Church and no other. So it was pretty obvious. Now, I did have a couple of false starts, but eventually I hooked up with the pastor of my closest Presbyterian church, which was in Otisville, New York. And he told me what I had to do, which was basically that I had to become a member of the church, that I had to be a member for 6 months in good standing, and then I could apply to the presbytery to become a candidate for ordination, which is what I did. And it was really quite enjoyable in a lot of ways, and one of the reasons, I mean, it's a daft reason, I guess, but I really like to sing. And the Presbyterian hymns are singable. I used to sit with my wife and my son in a front pew and sing really loud every Sunday. I never joined the choir because I was not interested in that side of things by that point. But I loved to just belt out the hymns on Sunday mornings. It was fantastic. And the pastor that I got hooked up with was fairly easygoing, and he introduced me to a lot of people in the presbytery. So after my 6 months was up, I went with one of the elders and the pastor to the presbytery and applied for candidacy, which was, I don't know what the word is, remarkable, because to be a candidate for ordination, technically you were supposed to go to seminary for 2 years and then be examined by the presbytery every 6 months or so on your progress, go forth year by year studying theology, doctrine, church discipline, Bible exegesis, and so forth. And I didn't want to do any of that because I had a master's degree in theology, but also I had published books on various aspects of Christianity and so forth. So I didn't feel like signing up for 2 years at seminary was going to be all that profitable. Plus, I was a tenured professor at that time, and I just didn't have the time. I would have had to either commute to Princeton in New Jersey or to New York City, both of which are about 2 hours away by car, and I just didn't have the time. So I sat before the committee that interviewed people for candidacy and just laid it out to them. I said, look, I can't do it. I don't have the time, and I've already done most of what's needed to pass the ordination exams. There are 5 ordination exams, and if I recall, they are church polity, biblical exegesis, doctrine, a very strange Bible knowledge exam that was only given once a year, and church history, I guess. And I knew I was, quite capable of passing all of them, and I laid that out to the committee. I said, look, I don't need to go to a seminary for 2 years to pass these exams. I've already done all this stuff in my university and in my publishing. And after a certain amount of hemming and hawing about it all, they let me go out of the room and then talked among themselves for a while, and then invited me back in and said that what they would do is that they would admit me to candidacy, and the minimum candidacy time was 1 year, but it was typically 2 years, but it could be shortened to 1 year under special circumstances. And they said that they would do that for me, and that what I would be required to do for the year that I was a candidate was to be a student minister of a church within the presbytery, which was something that I was very used to from my days in Australia, where the pastors of my church in Gawler in South Australia were typically students who were training for the ministry, because our church was small and poor, and so they were essentially going to give me a small, rural, poor church for a year, see how I did, and then assess at the end of a year. And that's what I did. I was given the church of Livingston Manor in Sullivan County, New York, and that's where my journey started. Now, the church, just like my church in South Australia, was poor and struggling, and there are a lot of things that I couldn't do as an unordained student minister. I couldn't perform the sacraments. I couldn't run session, which is the body of elders that governs the church. I couldn't do anything in an official capacity. What I could do is hold Sunday services, which meant, organizing the services each week, choosing readings, writing a sermon, just getting into the spirit of being a pastor, and of course holding office hours so that people could talk to me if they wanted to, and I was also expected to go and visit the shut-ins, and I did all that quite happily. And what I was experimenting with as I was a candidate for ordination was seeing if I could bring my vision of Christianity to the pulpit, to the church. That is, to see if the notion of spirituality, that is the essence of Christianity in my view, could be preached and taught from my position as pastor or student minister. Now this gets us into some stray territory which I'll have to get into in later videos, but a lot of people confuse religion with morality, and I see that as a fundamental error. I see religion as being concerned with spirituality, so that the general statement that some people make, I'm spiritual but not religious, I just find nonsensical. That if religion is not spiritual, it's not religion. So I also think that if people are not getting spirituality out of their religious experience, then the church is doing something wrong. That all the time you focus on morality, you've got the cart before the horse. That if you develop a sense of spirituality among people, then their behavior will change. But it is the spirituality that comes first, and the behavior that you want, if you like, the morality, follows from it, but you start with the spirituality. And I think that in my first year, I was, let's say, 25% successful, partly because I had never run a church before, and I had not really developed fully my concept of spirituality as opposed to morality. I had not really grasped how to put the Bible into spiritual terms for people through my sermons and so forth. It all came bit by bit, and that year was really an important year for me to develop my chops as a pastor. All right, well, let's leave it there for now. There's much more to the journey than that, but I did spend that year working out what it was that I wanted to present to a church. And I was, in fact, ordained at the end of that year. I'll talk about my exams, which turned out to be stranger than I expected. And then I'll talk about how I proceeded as a pastor from there. I ended up working as a pastor for 4 churches after that. And they were all different experiences. I think the most amazing experience was my third as interim pastor for Wappingers Falls Presbyterian Church in Dutchess County. But I'll get onto that next time, and meanwhile, if you like my videos, if you're interested, tell your friends, like and subscribe, and I'll see you on Tuesday for part 3.